Hello, my name's Marissa Bidwa and I'm the Employment Relations Advisor and the Manager of Taste for the Restaurant Association. And today I'm interviewing Fernando Peire from the Ivy. Now Fernando, you arrived very early on Saturday morning.
Yep.
That's right. And what was your first impression of New Zealand as you sort of walked into the airport, I suppose?
It was huge, actually.
Yeah.
Massive space and not so many people. A lot of people on my plane, but not so many people at the airport. But a lot of space, and everything was very, very modern, which surprised me. Because I went to Barbados, for example, expecting it to be super slick because of Concorde arriving.
Yeah.
I didn't go on Concorde, I went on a normal plane. But it was like stepping back into the 60s, whereas New Zealand was very much with the zeitgeist, I thought.
Yeah, and you'd heard some interesting comments about the hospitality industry in New Zealand as well, hadn't you?
Yeah.
Something about the 70s, is that right?
Yeah. I think it might have been a mischievous Australian who said that.
Oh, it would be, I'm
I'm
sure.
And they said that I could expect London in the 70s when I went to restaurants in New Zealand, but I don't think that's true.
Oh, that's good.
From what I've seen so far, from
Yeah.
eating last night in Auckland.
One thing that I think New Zealanders would be quite interested in here, because we have the Rugby World Cup coming up in 2011, very
Right.
shortly, in September. So New Zealanders are going to be faced with quite a large international market, and a lot of those people are going to be coming from your part of the world.
Yeah.
What do you think the average sort of English diner is expecting when they walk into a restaurant, as far as service is concerned?
Well,
I suppose you don't know a lot about the average person, do you? Because you're dealing with a very sort of non-average person.
well, no, I think we deal with everybody at the Ivy, really. No, we do.
Yeah.
And I would think that the majority of people would come like me to New Zealand, which is with no particular expectation, except when you're confronted with prices on a menu, then I think you'll have an idea of what to expect. And if the restaurant's anything like the one I went to yesterday, then I think people will be pleased. I mean, I had breakfast at a cafe in Auckland yesterday, very normal sort of place, and the staff were super nice in there.
And I think that's one thing Kiwis actually do pride themselves on, as far as service goes,
Friendliness.
is the friendliness.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's half the battle, you know. You can't teach somebody how to smile,
Yeah.
but you can teach them to carry plates. And if you've got staff who have a nice disposition, well, then people are going to be very open-minded towards them, I think.
Yeah, you'll probably be able to get away with a little bit more than you would otherwise.
Yeah. I think people will be pleasantly surprised when they come here.
Okay.
I have been by the architecture, for example, already.
Well, that's great. And we'll have to take you out a little bit more so you can check out a few more of the hospitality spots.
As long as it doesn't mean eating more, because I just keep eating too much.
That is something we like to do in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Definitely not so good for the figure. But another thing that I wanted to talk to you about is just some of the challenges that are facing your sector in your part of the world. Is there anything that comes to mind? Well, I guess recession, obviously, you're sort of still going through that, but
Yeah, we are.
besides that, I mean, that's sort of the thing that sort of everyone's kind of talking about. Is there anything else that...
I think my observation over the last 15 years or 20 years in the London restaurant business is that I always thought people would stop dining out at some point, or start dining less.
Yeah.
Well, I did, especially when economic difficulties come along. The first thing that used to fall by the wayside was restaurant spending in the old days, 70s, 80s. Restaurants were really heavily affected by recessions, whereas this time around it doesn't seem to be the case, Do
Do you think it's because it's so ingrained in our culture?
Yes,
now,
I think people see it now as not a luxury, but as a basic element of their week is dining out, So I think if anything, people might trade down, and I think that the restaurants that will suffer, as always, are the ones in the middle. The restaurants at the top end will do fine because there's always the next new millionaire, always, and they might not be from England, they might be from China next time. But and at the lower end there will always be a market, and I think that something I've seen in London is that canny restaurateurs are concentrating now on the lower end, if you like, you know, and opening restaurants where the prices are very fair, the portions are smaller, the glasses of wine are smaller, but you can go in there and look at a menu where things cost between £2 and £5, and you know that if you have a multiple of 5 or 6 of those components, your bill's going to be less than £25.
Yeah. So is it sort of taking the complication out of food in some ways, or is it just sort of packaging it differently? And
I think it's putting the customers more in control of what they spend.
Right.
For starters.
Yeah.
Because, you know, in a more confident time, there'll be restaurants where at night they'll only have a 3-course set menu, which is £45 for 3 courses. You know, the confident chefs will do that.
Yeah.
Where if you go to their restaurant, you're going to spend a minimum amount of money. Whereas these young restaurateurs who are opening in London now and running restaurants where they serve Italian, French or Spanish, they're not French so much, but Italian and Spanish food in small dishes for low price, they are doing really, really well and bringing the average spend down to somewhere that people are comfortable with.
Now, just to go back to where you started out in the industry. Now, you shared a really touching story with us about that moment in time when you decided that hospitality was for you. I wonder if you would mind sharing that.
Sure. So I'd had a kind of typical midlife crisis, but quite early, in my mid-30s. Because I suppose I'd started working so early and had so much pressure early on in my life that by the time I came to take stock, it wasn't as late as most middle-aged men. It happened to me, I was like 35 years old. And I really started to ask myself whether I was in the right business and whether I was doing the right thing. Because, like an awful lot of people that have worked in hospitality, people constantly asked me what my proper job was. You know, even when I was running some of the busiest restaurants going.
Yeah.
And so I started asking myself why I didn't have a proper job. And what is a proper job? You know, and maybe I should be doing something more creative, and you know, maybe something more intellectual, maybe something more to do with the stuff that I'd studied.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, the hours are antisocial, and so your friends and family always put a certain amount of pressure on you about that. Oh, you know, you never come to birthdays, you're never available, you can never come to a party, it's all that stuff. You know? So eventually, the voices got so loud in my head that I really had to go off, I felt, and take stock.
Yeah.
And I decided that I would go to a little quiet, remote farmhouse in France and have a think. But getting down there was awkward, and it turned out that I would have to have a car. So I decided to drive all the way down, and I actually thought that would be therapeutic, because it's always a good place to think, isn't it, when you're alone?
Absolutely, in the car. Yeah.
So there I was on this mission, and after a few days of peaceful thought, which I have to say was inconclusive, I was looking forward to driving back and coming to some conclusions on the way back to London.
Yeah.
But before that happened, a friend of mine called and said he wanted to come and visit with his girlfriend, who he wanted to introduce me to. He came down, and on the way back to Paris on the last day of my holiday, or the penultimate day, he asked whether he could not borrow my car, but drive my car with me as a passenger. And in the end, it was a quiet Sunday afternoon. There weren't many people on the motorway. It was June, the light was great. I said, okay, you can drive.
Yeah.
And about 15 minutes later, when I was having a nap, we had a catastrophic car crash. His girlfriend was killed. I was trapped in the car in a very, very dangerous situation.
Yeah.
And I ended up having to have a reconstructive surgery on my head, and it took me 6 months to get back to work. And what happened there that did change my life was I received the most extraordinary amount of mail from people in London who did very interesting things, people I really respected, who had proper jobs, telling me how different their life was now that I wasn't running the Ivy anymore. And to start with, I don't think I took it all in for what it was, for what it really meant, and I actually thought it was people just being nice and trying to make me feel good, you know. But then when I came back to London, I realised that my not being there had left a gap in people's lives.
Absolutely.
And that's when I thought that I could really continue to make a difference and teach people to join the industry because it was worthwhile.
Yeah.
And you are doing something other than just carrying plates of food.
Exactly.
And putting dustbins out.
And that's an invaluable point to make, I think, is basically the importance that we have on other people's lives.